My wife divorced me at my retirement party while my children cheered. I calmly signed the papers, leaned into the microphone, and whispered that they had no idea what they just did. 5 months later, they were begging on my doorstep. I am Michael, 66 years old, and a newly retired senior corporate auditor. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives with a single signature, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that loyalty should never be a one-way street. The air in the rented banquet hall smelled of stale beer and cheap vanilla frosting. 50 of my colleagues' people I had worked alongside for 30 years stood around tables covered in white plastic tablecloths. I held a plastic champagne flute in my right hand, waiting for the customary speeches to begin. It was supposed to be the culmination of my life's work. A quiet, respectable end to a career spent balancing ledgers and untangling corporate fraud. Barbara, my wife of 38 years, stepped up to the microphone at the front of the room. She wore a tailored crimson dress that I had paid for just a week prior. I expected a standard toast, perhaps a stiff but polite acknowledgement of my hard work. Instead, she bypassed the microphone stand, walked directly over to me, and slapped a thick manila envelope hard against my chest. I caught the envelope before it fell to the floor. The heavy paper felt dense in my hands. I looked up at Barbara, noticing the absolute lack of warmth in her eyes. She turned back to the crowd, grabbing the microphone. Her voice echoed loudly across the silent room. She announced to my 50 colleagues and friends that she was filing for divorce immediately. She stated that she was demanding half of everything I had ever earned. She actually used the word freeing. She said she was finally freeing herself from a dead-end marriage to a man who possessed zero ambition. Before the shock could even register across the faces of my coworkers, a sickening sound cut through the room. It was applause. I turned my head and saw my 38-year-old son Christopher standing by the buffet table, clapping his hands together with a massive grin on his face. Beside him, my 35-year-old daughter Megan joined in the applause. Then Christopher's wife Natalie and Megan's husband Brian stood up and cheered. My own blood, my own family, celebrating my public execution. The silence from my colleagues was deafening. They stared at me with a mixture of profound pity and absolute horror. The plastic champagne flute in my hand felt fragile, but I did not drop it. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum or beg for an explanation. 30 years as a senior auditor had trained me to detach my emotions when confronted with a catastrophic systemic failure. My marriage and my family had just failed. It was time to assess the damage. I set the plastic flute down on the nearest table. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my Mont Blanc pen. I opened the manila envelope right there in the middle of the room. I flipped to the back page of the divorce petition, found the acknowledgement of service line, and signed my name in steady, perfect cursive. I closed the file, handed it back to Barbara, and leaned directly into the microphone she was still holding. "You have absolutely no idea what you just did," I whispered. My voice carried through the speakers, cold and completely devoid of fear. I turned around and walked out of the banquet hall. I did not look back. I left them standing there in stunned silence, leaving the party behind me forever. I drove straight to our 4-bedroom suburban home. The house was quiet, filled with expensive furniture and decades of accumulated memories that suddenly meant absolutely nothing to me. I did not go into the master bedroom to pack my wardrobe. I did not grab my golf clubs or my collection of vintage watches. I walked into my home office, pulled a single canvas duffel bag from the closet, and began packing. I packed 1 dark gray suit, 3 dress shirts, and my shaving kit. Then I opened my filing cabinet and packed the only things that truly mattered. I took the original deeds, the corporate charter documents for my holding companies, the encrypted hard drives, and the master tax ledgers. Everything else was just useless weight. I was zipping up the bag when the front door burst open downstairs. Heavy footsteps pounded up the hardwood stairs. Barbara stormed into my office, closely followed by Christopher. He had a smug, victorious look on his face, standing with his arms crossed over his chest. Barbara immediately demanded that I vacate the premises by morning. She declared that her lawyer had assured her a judge would grant her exclusive use of the marital home. Christopher stepped forward, invading my personal space. He sneered and told me it was about time someone put me in my place. He mocked my entire 30-year career. He called me a boring, terrified bean counter. He claimed that my lack of vision and my obsession with rules had stifled the family's true potential. He said I was a financial anchor, dragging them all down. I looked at my son. I looked at the tailored Italian suit he was wearing. I remembered the $300,000 out-of-court settlement I had quietly paid 5 years ago to keep him out of federal prison for corporate embezzlement at his first startup. I had liquidated half of my private retirement fund to save him hiding the truth from Barbara, so she would not look at her golden boy with disgust. I had absorbed all of his failures in absolute silence. I did not remind him of that fact. Reminding an arrogant man of his debts only makes him hate you more. Barbara stepped around him and held out her hand. She demanded the keys to the heavy steel safe in the basement. She then demanded a written list of every password to our primary investment accounts, the savings accounts, and the digital portfolios. She threatened to call the police and claim I was destroying marital assets if I did not comply. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key to the safe, and dropped it into her open palm. I reached over to my desk, picked up a notepad, and cleanly wrote down the master password to the primary investment portal. I handed her the paper without a single word of protest. They both looked slightly confused by my complete lack of resistance. Bullies always expect a fight. When you give them exactly what they ask for, it briefly short-circuits their brains. I picked up my duffel bag, walked past them, and went down the stairs. I walked out the front door and stepped into the cool night air. I got into my car and drove down to the end of the street, pulling over under the shadow of a large oak tree. I kept the engine running and watched my house from a distance. A few minutes later, the lights in my home office flicked on. I knew exactly what Barbara was doing. She was rushing to the computer to log into the investment portal, eager to look at the money she believed was now entirely hers. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my private banking application. 3 minutes before they arrived at the house, I had executed a specific digital command. I had activated a change of marital status clause that I had legally embedded into the foundation of our joint trusts years ago. The moment Barbara entered that master password on her end, the system flagged her login as unauthorized under the new legal parameters. I watched the office window. I imagined the red error screen flashing on the monitor. The accounts were instantly locked down under an automated security freeze. Neither she nor I could move a single penny without a court order. I put my car in drive and drove toward the city, leaving them to their panic. The next morning, the sun glared brightly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Anthony Reed's high-rise corner office. Anthony was a ruthless wealth protection attorney. He did not handle amicable splits. He handled financial warfare. He wore a sharp navy pinstripe suit and had the cold, unblinking eyes of a predator. I sat across from his massive glass desk, sipping a cup of black coffee. Anthony was reading through a thick stack of legal documents that had been delivered by courier 20 minutes earlier. Barbara's aggressive divorce lawyer had wasted no time. They had filed an emergency injunction at the courthouse the moment the doors opened. The injunction demanded an immediate freeze on my corporate pension. Furthermore, it formally petitioned the court to seize the 4-bedroom suburban house and award it entirely to Barbara, citing emotional distress and financial abandonment. Anthony dropped the documents onto his desk with a loud smack. He leaned forward, cracking his knuckles. He told me the injunction was aggressive but sloppy. He laid out a battle plan. He said we would file a counter motion by noon. He promised to tie her lawyer up in discovery for 18 months. He swore he could protect the pension and force the sale of the house, splitting the equity right down the middle. I placed my coffee cup on the saucer. The porcelain made a sharp clinking sound in the quiet room. I looked Anthony directly in the eyes and told him we were not going to fight the injunction. Anthony stopped mid-sentence. He blinked, staring at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. He asked me to repeat myself. I instructed Anthony to draft a consent order immediately. I told him to stipulate that I agreed with all of her demands. I wanted to give Barbara 100% of the suburban house free and clear of my name on the deed. I also instructed him to sign over the entirety of the frozen joint investment accounts directly to her. I wanted zero claim on any of those specific assets. Anthony leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. He studied my face for a long time. He warned me that once the judge signed a consent order, it was practically irreversible. He reminded me that I was walking away from nearly $2 million in visible marital assets. He asked me very slowly and deliberately if I was absolutely sure about this strategy. I smiled for the first time since the retirement party. I told Anthony that as an auditor, I specialized in identifying toxic assets that looked valuable on paper, but were actually financial time bombs. I told him the house and those accounts were no longer assets. They were traps. Anthony did not ask any more questions. He recognized the tone of a man who had already calculated the exact trajectory of the knife. He buzzed his paralegal and dictated the consent order. Within an hour, the document was printed and placed on the glass desk in front of me. It explicitly transferred all rights ownership and assumed liabilities of the property and the specified accounts to Barbara Gallagher. I took out my Mont Blanc pen and signed my name on the bottom line with absolute precision. The paperwork was sent back to the courthouse. The trap was officially set, legally binding and completely irreversible. My family thought they had just robbed me blind. They had no idea they had just volunteered to stand on a landmine. I later learned exactly how my family chose to spend their first evening as the newly crowned masters of my estate. They did not spend it in quiet reflection or respectful silence. They spent it bathing in unearned arrogance and intoxicating greed. Barbara went straight down the hardwood stairs into my private wine cellar in the basement. She completely bypassed the standard bottles of table wine and reached directly for a rare vintage champagne I had carefully preserved for my eventual retirement trip to the Amalfi Coast. She carried the dark green bottle upstairs to the living room, popping the cork with a loud crack that echoed sharply through the high vaulted ceilings of the house I had paid for over 3 decades of grueling labor. Christopher and Megan sat comfortably on the custom Italian leather sofa I had imported for our anniversary 5 years ago. They held out delicate crystal flutes to catch the spilling white foam. They eagerly toasted to their absolute victory and my supposed defeat. They laughed loudly at how easily I had folded under the pressure of the emergency court injunction. Christopher proudly declared that my rapid surrender was the ultimate and undeniable proof of my inherent cowardice. He told his mother and sister that 30 years of sitting safely behind a corporate desk had made me completely soft, utterly terrified of real conflict, and incapable of defending my own territory. He insisted with a smug grin that I was simply a weak and exhausted old man who could not stomach the brutal reality of a protracted legal war. They truly and deeply believed they had thoroughly outsmarted a senior corporate auditor. They foolishly mistook my surgical precision for blind panic. They sat in a beautiful house I built from nothing, drinking expensive wine I bought with my labor, celebrating the immense wealth they firmly thought they had just stolen from me. They failed to realize that men in my profession do not surrender assets unless those assets are strategically designed to destroy the person receiving them. The celebratory atmosphere in the living room did not last very long before their individual desperate greed began to rot their unholy alliance from the inside out. The vintage champagne was not even completely empty when my daughter Megan made her first aggressive demand. She set her crystal glass down hard on the solid mahogany coffee table and turned her full attention to her mother. Megan had spent the last 4 years carefully and maliciously hiding a massive financial secret from her husband Brian. She had secretly accumulated over $80,000 in high-interest credit card debt to fund a luxurious lifestyle she could not legitimately afford. She had relentlessly purchased designer handbags, booked luxury weekend vacations with her friends, and bought incredibly expensive jewelry, all while repeatedly lying to Brian. She told him she was receiving massive quarterly bonuses from her completely mediocre corporate marketing job. The reality was that her creditors were now aggressively calling her phone 10 times a day and threatening to place a legal lien on her luxury vehicle. Megan fiercely demanded that Barbara log into the newly acquired joint investment accounts the very moment the local bank opened its doors in the morning. She demanded that Barbara wire her the full $80,000 immediately to erase her secret debt. She framed this outrageous demand as a necessary and fully deserved reward for her unwavering loyalty during the sudden divorce proceedings. Barbara, completely drunk on her new perceived power and overflowing with a false sense of immense wealth, agreed without a single second of hesitation or thought. She confidently promised Megan that the enormous sum of money would be transferred into her private checking account by noon the following day. Barbara blindly assumed that the judge signing the expedited consent order would automatically act as a magic wand, instantly dissolving the complex security freeze I had carefully placed on the mutual funds. She had absolutely no fundamental understanding of how rigid corporate banking security structures actually operated in the real world. She believed her mere signature was a master key to my life savings. My son Christopher was completely uninterested in a mere $80,000 of liquid cash. His dark ambitions were much larger, and his hidden reality was far more desperate than his sister's shopping debts. His flashy technology startup was nothing more than a complete financial illusion built on aggressive lies and forged projections. He had rapidly burned through $3 million of initial investor capital in less than 2 years. Instead of funding actual software product development, he had recklessly spent the venture capital on lavish downtown office spaces, luxury corporate retreats, and a completely unsustainable personal salary to maintain his image. His corporate payroll account was dangerously overdrawn, and his primary financial investors were angrily demanding a comprehensive forensic audit of his books by the end of the week. If those seasoned investors discovered he had deliberately misappropriated their funds for his own personal enrichment, he would face immediate and severe federal wire fraud charges. A prison sentence was looming directly over his head. Christopher needed a massive influx of untraceable cash immediately to cover his tracks and fabricate a functioning balance sheet. He knew that liquidating the joint investment accounts would take far too long to clear probate and satisfy the rigorous legal transfer requirements. He needed the real estate. He desperately needed the physical house to save his own freedom. He confidently picked up the legally binding consent order from the granite kitchen counter. He stared intensely at the bottom line where I had calmly signed away 100% of the property rights directly to his mother. He proudly told Barbara he was taking the original deed to the commercial bank first thing in the morning. He boldly planned to use the large 4-bedroom suburban home as high-value collateral to immediately secure a $500,000 emergency line of credit for his sinking business. He spoke with the absolute unyielding confidence of a deeply arrogant man who firmly believed the entire world existed simply to serve his immediate needs, entirely blind to the trap closing around his throat. The very next morning, the sky was bright and clear as Christopher confidently walked into the towering glass and steel lobby of the premier commercial bank downtown. He wore his most expensive tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek imported leather briefcase perfectly projecting the carefully crafted image of a highly successful and wealthy young entrepreneur. He walked past the standard teller lines with his head held high and was escorted directly into the plush, quiet office of a senior commercial loan officer. With an incredibly smug and victorious smile on his face, Christopher smoothly slid the original heavy paper house deed and the freshly minted judge-signed court order across the polished wooden desk. He confidently and aggressively demanded an expedited commercial loan, boasting loudly about the massive untapped equity sitting perfectly clear in the sprawling suburban property. He spoke to the banking professional as if the man were a simple servant meant to quickly process his victory. The senior loan officer nodded politely, adjusted his glasses, and began systematically typing the residential property address and the specific legal parcel numbers into the bank's highly secure central database. Christopher casually leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his legs and already mentally planning exactly how he would rapidly distribute the incoming funds to silence his angry and suspicious investors. He felt utterly invincible, fully convinced that my years of hard work were about to fund his ultimate salvation. Then the rhythmic sound of typing in the quiet office suddenly stopped. The loan officer froze in his seat, his fingers hovering stiffly over the keyboard. He leaned much closer to his glowing computer screen, his eyebrows furrowing together in deep, genuine confusion. He pressed another sequence of keys, waiting a few agonizing seconds for a secondary financial background screen to fully load into the system. Slowly, visibly, the warm blood completely drained from the senior loan officer's face, leaving his complexion looking almost entirely pale. He swallowed hard, nervously, looking up from the harsh light of the monitor to stare directly into my son's arrogant eyes. The silence in the room grew incredibly heavy and suffocating, replacing all of Christopher's previous confidence with a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety. The loan officer slowly reached out and pushed the original property deed back across the polished wooden desk, treating the document as if it were suddenly radioactive or deeply poisonous. He cleared his throat quietly and formally informed Christopher that the commercial bank absolutely could not extend a single dollar of credit against that specific property. He looked Christopher dead in the eye and stated with absolute crushing finality that the grand suburban house was no longer a financial asset. The senior loan officer did not simply reject my son Christopher. He stood up from his polished desk, walked out of his office, and immediately summoned the regional branch manager. Within 30 minutes, Barbara received an urgent and highly confidential phone call demanding her immediate presence at the commercial bank. She arrived in her luxury sport utility vehicle, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying an expensive leather handbag. She walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank with her chin held high, fully expecting to sign the final authorization paperwork for a massive cash transfer. She firmly believed the bank was calling her down to formally recognize her new status as a woman of immense independent wealth. Instead, she was escorted into a cold, glass-walled conference room at the back of the building. She found Christopher sitting at the long mahogany table, his face completely drained of color, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his expensive leather briefcase. The regional branch manager walked into the room carrying a thick stack of heavily redacted financial documents. He did not offer them coffee. He did not offer them a polite greeting. He sat down at the head of the table and slid the original property deed, the exact document Barbara had fought so ruthlessly to acquire, into the center of the table. Barbara smiled arrogantly and confidently stated that the sprawling 4-bedroom suburban house had been fully paid off over a decade ago. She proudly declared that she was now the sole owner of a completely unencumbered asset worth over $1 million thanks to the expedited divorce decree. The branch manager looked at her with a mixture of professional pity and absolute bewilderment. He folded his hands precisely on the table and politely corrected her. He calmly informed her that the suburban house was not a free and clear asset. It was heavily burdened by a massive, highly toxic secondary lien. Christopher suddenly slammed his hands on the table, his carefully crafted professional image cracking under the pressure. He loudly protested, demanding to know where hundreds of thousands of dollars could have possibly gone. He pointed an accusatory finger, claiming that I must have secretly squandered their inheritance on gambling or hidden offshore accounts. He demanded the bank launch a full investigation into my financial history, convinced that I was a master criminal who had quietly drained the family wealth. The branch manager did not argue. He simply reached into the thick stack of documents, pulled out a single sheet of authenticated banking records, and handed it directly to Christopher. It was the original loan disbursement ledger from 7 years ago. The manager calmly explained that the borrowed money had not gone to a secret offshore bank account, nor had it been spent on lavish personal indulgences. The ledger clearly showed that the entirety of the funds had been wired directly to a high-powered corporate defense firm. Christopher stared at the name of the law firm printed on the paper, and the air completely left his lungs. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. 7 years ago, Christopher's very first technology company had faced a catastrophic corporate negligence and investor fraud lawsuit. He had been facing a mandatory 10-year federal prison sentence for grossly mishandling venture capital. I had quietly stepped in to save his life. I had leveraged our family home to the absolute brink of foreclosure, pulling out every single dollar of available equity to secure the absolute best legal defense team in the country and quietly settle the massive lawsuit completely out of court. I had absorbed the entirety of his failure. I had never told him the truth foolishly, choosing to protect his fragile ego so he could continue pretending to be a self-made entrepreneurial genius. For 7 long years, I had quietly serviced the crushing monthly interest payments on that massive loan from my own corporate salary, carrying the heavy burden of his mistakes in absolute silence. Barbara stared at the paperwork in absolute shock. Her mind raced to understand the legal implications of what was sitting on the table. She turned to the branch manager and desperately argued that since my name was originally on the loan, the massive debt was still my sole responsibility. She loudly insisted that the bank needed to pursue me for the money, not her. The branch manager slowly shook his head. He pulled out the legally binding consent order that Anthony Reed had so carefully drafted. He pointed to the exact paragraph where Barbara had aggressively demanded sole and exclusive ownership of the estate, fully indemnifying me from all future claims regarding the property. By forcing me to sign that document under the threat of an emergency court injunction, she had legally severed my financial obligation to the house entirely. The consent order she had proudly waved in my face made her the sole legal guarantor of the massive debt. She had literally begged the court to hand her a live grenade. Then the manager delivered the fatal blow. He calmly explained that the loan I had taken out to save Christopher was not a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. It was a high-risk commercial balloon loan. The sudden and absolute transfer of the property deed into her sole name had automatically triggered an aggressive acceleration clause embedded deep within the banking contract. The bank no longer required monthly interest payments. The entire remaining principal balance of nearly $700,000 was now due in full. The manager looked at his calendar and stated with absolute crushing finality that she had exactly 14 days to produce the entire sum. If the payment was not received in full by the end of the 14th business day, the commercial bank would immediately foreclose on the property, evict her from the premises, and seize the house to auction it off. Panic completely consumed the sterile conference room. Christopher pushed his chair back and began hyperventilating, running his hands nervously through his hair. He realized that without the house as collateral, his current failing business was truly dead, and his angry investors would soon discover his current financial crimes. His father was no longer there to silently buy his freedom. Barbara, however, suddenly stopped crying. A desperate, manic smile spread across her face. She sat up straight, smoothing the wrinkles from her expensive dress. She waved her hand dismissively at the branch manager, telling him to simply wait a moment and stop being so dramatic. She loudly declared that she had absolute control over the joint marital investment accounts, which she firmly believed held nearly $2 million in liquid mutual funds. She proudly stated that $700,000 was nothing to her. She pulled her sleek silver laptop from her designer handbag, opened it right there on the conference table, and quickly connected to the bank's wireless network. She typed in her master password, fully intending to wire the required funds immediately and clear the mortgage, proving to everyone in the room that she was a powerful and independent woman. The banking portal loaded on her screen. The small loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the primary dashboard appeared. The total available balance displayed on the high-definition screen was exactly $0.00. Barbara screamed. It was not a word, but a harsh guttural sound of pure terror. She began smashing her fingers violently against the keyboard, desperately refreshing the web page over and over again. The number remained an absolute unforgiving 0. She shoved the laptop across the table toward the branch manager, demanding in a shrill voice that he fix the broken computer system. She accused the bank of malicious theft. She accused me of breaking the law and illegally hiding her rightful fortune. The branch manager did not touch the computer. He calmly pulled up her specific portfolio on his own secure terminal. He looked at the long history of transactions and sighed heavily. He informed her that I had not stolen a single penny, nor had I broken any laws. The truth was far more precise and far more devastating. Months before my retirement party, carefully anticipating her eventual betrayal based on her increasingly cold behavior, I had legally and quietly liquidated my exact 50% share of the mutual funds. I had utilized a perfectly legal tax loophole to transfer my specific legal portion of the wealth into an untouchable blind private trust. I had left her exact 50% perfectly intact within the joint portal. I had not touched a single dime of her money. However, Barbara had spent the last 3 years living a secret life of incredible luxury. She had been secretly making massive, unauthorized early withdrawals from her portion of those specific accounts to secretly fund expensive vacations with her friends, buy high-end jewelry, and maintain an illusion of extreme wealth at the country club. She had carefully hidden the physical banking statements from me, assuming the pile of money was endless. The branch manager pointed to the screen, explaining the brutal mathematics of her greed. By repeatedly pulling money out of those specific restricted funds long before the legal retirement age, she had unknowingly triggered a series of devastating early withdrawal penalties. Furthermore, those reckless withdrawals had generated massive compounded federal tax liabilities. The automated banking system had systematically drained her remaining half of the portfolio to pay the severe federal penalties and the massive tax debts she had personally incurred. The money was completely gone because she had already spent it, and the penalties had consumed whatever small fraction was left. She had absolutely nothing left to save the house her son was facing, total ruin, and her 14 days were already rapidly ticking away. The flashing yellow lights of a heavy commercial tow truck brightly illuminated the front windows of my daughter Megan's upscale suburban townhouse at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I know this precise time because my digital security application sent an automated notification directly to my phone the moment the repossession order was successfully executed. Megan and her husband Brian had been sleeping soundly in their master bedroom, completely unaware that the heavy steel chains of consequence were currently wrapping tightly around the front axle of their imported luxury sport utility vehicle. Megan had spent the last 3 entire years treating that $90,000 piece of machinery as her own personal throne. She drove it to her expensive weekend brunch dates. She parked it proudly in the premier spots at her exclusive country club, and she constantly posted highly edited photographs of herself sitting confidently behind the premium leather steering wheel. She firmly believed that the vehicle was a permanent and rightful fixture in her carefully curated, luxurious life. She never once bothered to understand the complex financial mechanics that actually kept it parked safely in her driveway every single night. My personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the wooden nightstand of my quiet hotel room. I calmly reached over, saw my daughter's name flashing brightly on the digital screen, and answered the incoming call on the 4th ring. I did not say hello or offer any warm parental greeting. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened to the absolute chaos erupting on the other end of the line. Megan was screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She was standing barefoot in her front yard, wearing her expensive silk pajamas, frantically shouting at a large tow truck driver who was completely ignoring her every word. She aggressively demanded that I speak to the working man immediately. She screamed into the phone that there had been a terrible and embarrassing administrative mistake. She loudly accused me of becoming senile and forgetting to make the monthly vehicle payment, demanding that I immediately wire the banking institution whatever massive sum of money was required to release her precious car. She spoke to me with the exact same venom, entitlement, and utter disrespect she had so proudly displayed at my retirement party. I patiently let her scream and cry until she finally ran out of breath. The heavy silence stretched across the phone line for several long seconds. I took a slow, deliberate sip of cold water from the glass resting on my nightstand. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any parental warmth, sympathy, or anger. I bluntly informed my adult daughter that there was absolutely no administrative mistake, and there was certainly no missed financial payment. I instructed her to look very closely at the man who was currently pulling her beautiful car away into the dark night. I explained that he was not a standard bank repossession agent chasing a defaulted personal loan. He was a specialized corporate fleet recovery agent dispatched directly from the premier luxury dealership downtown. I systematically and clearly explained the harsh reality of the situation to her. That massive, beautiful car was never her legal property. It was not even my personal property. It was a highly exclusive corporate lease vehicle, fully subsidized and owned by my auditing firm as a strict part of my senior executive compensation package. For 3 consecutive years, I had quietly allocated my own personal corporate vehicle allowance to provide her with a safe, reliable, and incredibly luxurious mode of transportation. I had personally paid the massive commercial insurance premiums every month. I had silently covered the ridiculously expensive routine maintenance costs. I had done all of this simply because she was my only daughter, and I had foolishly wanted to make her life a little bit easier while she built her career. But the fundamental parameters of our relationship had permanently changed. I coldly reminded her of the champagne toast at the rented banquet hall. I clearly reminded her of the exact moment she eagerly stood up and enthusiastically applauded as her mother publicly divorced me and mocked my entire 30-year career. She had happily cheered for my sudden retirement. She had openly celebrated my forced departure from her daily life. Therefore, I simply finalized my official retirement paperwork like a responsible corporate officer. When a senior partner officially retires from the firm, all corporate assets must be immediately surrendered back to the company. 2 days ago, I calmly walked into the luxury car dealership, handed the general manager the spare set of electronic keys, and formally canceled the corporate lease agreement. I legally authorized the dealership to recover their vehicle from her private property at their absolute earliest convenience. Megan gasped loudly into the phone, the sound echoing with pure disbelief. She frantically demanded to know exactly how he was supposed to get to her corporate marketing job, or go to the grocery store in the morning. I politely and coldly suggested she utilize a public city bus, or perhaps purchase a simple bicycle. I forcefully reminded her that she was 35 years old and fully capable of solving her own basic transportation logistics. Before she could launch into another hysterical and demanding tantrum, I calmly ended the phone call and completely powered down my device for the remainder of the peaceful night. The financial shockwave of that single calculated action completely shattered the incredibly fragile foundation of her marriage. I learned from a mutual family acquaintance exactly what devastating events transpired next in that cold driveway. Megan slowly turned to her husband Brian, fully expecting him to fiercely defend her honor, comfort her tears, and perhaps promise to immediately purchase a brand new car for her the very next day. Instead, Brian was standing completely still, staring at the empty concrete driveway, with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic spreading across his face. Brian worked in highly competitive, high-end medical equipment sales. His entire lucrative career relied heavily on projecting a flawless image of extreme wealth and immense personal success to wealthy doctors, hospital administrators, and private clinic owners. He desperately needed that specific luxury vehicle to transport his high-profile clients to expensive golf courses and lavish steakhouse dinners. Without that highly impressive vehicle to legitimize his status, Brian was instantly reduced to just another ordinary, desperate salesman. He quickly turned to Megan, his face turning bright red with intense anger and rising fear. He aggressively demanded to know exactly how they were going to afford a suitable replacement luxury vehicle on such incredibly short notice. That precise question was the exact moment the suffocating, crushing weight of Megan's completely secret financial life finally collapsed onto both of them. Cornered and out of options, Megan finally had to confess the ugly truth. She tearfully admitted that she could not possibly qualify for a new auto loan because her personal credit score was completely destroyed. She confessed to the $80,000 in secret high-interest credit card debt she had been carefully hiding from him for years. She desperately confessed that her mother was supposed to bail her out that very morning, but the massive joint family investment accounts were completely empty. Brian did not offer her a supportive shoulder to cry on. He did not romantically vow to work through the severe financial hardship together as a team. The beautiful, shiny illusion of their perfect, wealthy suburban life was instantly and permanently obliterated. He suddenly realized he was legally bound to a deeply deceitful woman who had systematically lied to him and secretly plunged their entire future into massive, inescapable debt. He turned his back on his weeping wife, walked straight back into their upscale townhouse, and immediately began packing his expensive suitcases. Their entire marriage fractured permanently and irreparably in the span of a single hour, completely destroyed by the sudden removal of my silent, unappreciated financial support. However, instead of finally looking in the mirror and accepting full responsibility for their own greedy, reckless actions, my toxic family chose a completely different path. They aggressively regrouped the very next morning to form a new battle plan. Barbara, Christopher, and Megan held an urgent emergency meeting in the grand living room of the massive suburban house they were completely failing to save from imminent bank foreclosure. They absolutely refused to believe that their sudden catastrophic financial ruin was simply the natural consequence of their own profound arrogance. They quickly convinced themselves of a wild, highly desperate conspiracy theory to protect their fragile egos. They collectively decided that my chillingly calm demeanor and my surgical precision were clear, undeniable signs of immense hidden wealth. They stubbornly reasoned that no sane man could walk away from a 30-year marriage and a highly lucrative corporate career so easily unless he had millions of dollars secretly stashed away in untouchable offshore banking accounts. Fueled entirely by blind rage, extreme jealousy, and absolute desperation, they immediately contacted a predatory, high-priced litigation attorney in the city. They confidently decided to file a massive, aggressive civil lawsuit against me, fully intent on dragging me back into a public courtroom to uncover my supposed hidden assets and force me to pay for the massive disasters they had created themselves. They were entirely unaware that by launching this final desperate legal attack, they were willingly walking directly into the final inescapable trap I had meticulously prepared for them. The early morning mist clung heavily to the surface of the dark, quiet lake. I sat completely alone in a small, rented aluminum boat, holding a simple fiberglass fishing rod in my hands. The water was perfectly still, acting like a giant mirror, reflecting the towering pine trees that tightly lined the rocky shore. For the very first time in over 3 decades of a highly stressful adult life, my mind was entirely quiet. I was no longer spending my mornings calculating massive quarterly tax liabilities for greedy corporate executives. I was no longer carefully managing the fragile and explosive egos of my ungrateful wife and children. I was simply watching a small red and white plastic bobber float peacefully on the cold water. The absolute pure silence of the natural landscape was an incredibly stark contrast to the chaotic, screaming demands that had defined my previous existence. I breathed in the crisp autumn air and felt a profound, deeply satisfying sense of personal peace. I had earned this quiet retirement. That profound peace was abruptly interrupted by the low, aggressive hum of a small motorboat approaching rapidly from the public wooden dock. I did not turn my head, at first assuming it was simply another early morning fisherman heading out for the day. But the loud boat slowed down and pulled up directly alongside my small aluminum vessel. A young man wearing a cheap nylon windbreaker stood up carefully, balancing himself in the rocking boat. He looked down at a clipboard in his hands and asked in a loud, flat voice if my legal name was Michael Gallagher. I calmly reeled in my fishing line, secured the sharp hook against the rod, and looked the young man directly in the eye. I offered a single silent nod. He immediately reached inside his waterproof jacket, pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound tightly by a thick blue rubber band, and dropped them unceremoniously onto the wet wooden seat of my boat. He formally informed me that I had been officially served by the county court. He did not offer a polite apology for ruining my morning. He simply turned his boat around and sped quickly back toward the distant shore, leaving me alone with the heavy paperwork. I did not panic. I did not throw the thick stack of papers into the dark lake. I picked up the heavy bundle, removed the tight blue rubber band, and began reading the front page of the petition. It was a massive, aggressive civil lawsuit filed in the county superior court. Barbara was officially suing me for severe marital fraud and gross financial deception. The legal petition was incredibly hostile and completely unhinged from reality. She and her new notoriously aggressive litigation attorney had meticulously constructed a wild fictional fantasy to completely excuse her own devastating financial ruin. The legal document formally and maliciously accused me of secretly funneling millions of dollars in marital assets into illegal, untraceable offshore bank accounts over the last 10 consecutive years. She boldly claimed in writing that I had deliberately orchestrated my own sudden retirement as a highly calculated malicious smokescreen to abandon her and run away with a massive hidden fortune. She wrote that my calm, silent demeanor at the retirement party was absolute proof of my psychopathic greed and my hidden wealth. I read through the wild legal accusations with a cold, analytical eye. It was truly fascinating to witness the extreme, exhausting lengths to which a desperate mind will go to avoid taking any personal responsibility. Barbara, Christopher, and Megan were currently drowning in the massive, suffocating debts they had selfishly created through their own endless greed. Instead of finding honest hard work or selling their luxury items to survive, they had chosen to gamble the very last of their borrowed money on a predatory lawyer. They firmly believed that if they squeezed me hard enough, in a public courtroom, gold coins would simply fall out of my pockets. They were hunting desperately for a non-existent treasure chest to magically fix their shattered lives. Within 48 hours, the aggressive legal discovery phase officially began. Barbara's new high-priced attorney did not hold back a single punch. He launched a full-scale invasive forensic audit of my entire adult life. He filed endless court subpoenas demanding total access to my personal bank statements, my credit card histories, my decades of tax returns, and my corporate retirement accounts. He hired aggressive private investigators to question my former colleagues loudly, demanding endless financial records from my old corporate auditing firm. He specifically targeted the Human Resources Department, hoping to uncover secret executive bonuses or hidden stock options that I might have successfully concealed during the rapid divorce settlement. I sat quietly in Anthony Reed's comfortable office and watched the massive mountains of requested paperwork pile up on his pristine glass desk. Anthony looked at the towering stacks of documents and asked if I wanted him to aggressively block the subpoenas to protect my basic privacy and stall their momentum. I calmly shook my head. I instructed Anthony to comply fully with every single demand they made. I told him to open the doors wide and let them completely exhaust themselves, searching an entirely empty house. For 3 long weeks, Barbara's lawyer dug furiously through 30 years of my highly detailed financial history. He found absolutely nothing but a boring, meticulously documented record of a man who paid his taxes on time and lived well below his actual means. They found the massive, undeniable records of the payments I had made to save Christopher from federal prison. They found the heavy corporate lease agreements I had silently paid to keep Megan in a luxury vehicle. They found the exact banking records of Barbara's reckless, unauthorized early withdrawals from the retirement funds. They found the absolute truth, but the truth did not give them any money. Just as her aggressive lawyer was about to give up entirely and drop the frivolous case due to a total lack of evidence, he stumbled upon a single obscure legal thread. During a deep, extensive search of state business registries, he discovered a mysterious corporate holding company that I had quietly and legally registered in the state of Delaware exactly 5 years ago. Delaware is widely known in the financial world as a massive corporate tax haven, a place where incredibly wealthy individuals frequently hide their most valuable and secretive assets behind thick legal walls of privacy. The company was entirely privately held under my sole direction, and its internal financial records were strictly shielded from basic public databases. It looked exactly like the perfect black box they had been desperately searching for. Barbara and her children immediately celebrated this discovery. I was told by mutual acquaintances that they were absolutely ecstatic and popping cheap champagne in their failing suburban home. They firmly believed they had finally found the smoking gun. They completely convinced themselves that this hidden Delaware holding company was the secret offshore vault where I was hiding millions of dollars in stolen cash. They blindly assumed it was a massive illegal slush fund containing their stolen inheritance. Barbara's lawyer immediately marched into the courthouse and filed an emergency order demanding full, unrestricted access to the complete financial master ledger of this specific holding company. He argued passionately before a judge that this secretive company was the absolute key to proving my profound marital fraud. The judge fully agreed with his dramatic argument and granted the court order giving me exactly 48 hours to surrender the private corporate ledger or face immediate arrest for contempt of court. Anthony Reed called me directly into his high-rise office the very moment the judge officially signed the demanding order. He looked slightly concerned as I walked through his door. He solemnly warned me that if this hidden Delaware company held any significant financial assets that had not been fully disclosed during our initial expedited divorce proceedings, I could be facing severe legal penalties and possible criminal charges for perjury. He leaned across his glass desk and asked me directly what exactly was hidden inside the holding company. I sat comfortably across from Anthony and smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. I opened my weathered leather briefcase, pulled out a single thin black binder, and placed it gently onto his polished desk. I calmly told him that this binder contained the complete and highly accurate master ledger for the Delaware holding company they were so absolutely desperate to find. I instructed Anthony to send it to Barbara's lawyer immediately via a registered legal courier. I did not fight the aggressive court subpoena. I did not hide behind complex corporate privacy laws. I willingly and easily handed over the exact document they were furiously demanding. I wanted them to eagerly open that black binder. I wanted them to read every single detailed page, because I knew exactly what they would find inside. I knew that the mysterious corporate entity did not hold millions of dollars in stolen cash, liquid mutual funds, or hidden real estate. It held something far more legally complex and far more devastating to their aggressive lawsuit. They had recklessly spent tens of thousands of dollars in borrowed legal fees, violently tearing down a heavy locked door, completely unaware that I had specifically and carefully designed the room behind it to be a legal dead end. The final, undeniable piece of their total financial destruction was printed right there in clear black and white ink, and they had just utilized the full power of the county court system to legally demand that I hand it directly to them. The air inside the downtown legal deposition room was completely stagnant and thick with manufactured hostility. It felt intentionally claustrophobic, designed specifically to break the spirit of anyone sitting on the defensive side of the massive dark oak conference table. A certified court reporter sat quietly in the far corner of the small room, her fingers resting lightly on the keys of her stenograph machine, ready to permanently record my supposed financial execution. I sat perfectly still on one side of the heavy wooden table, resting my hands comfortably on my lap right next to Anthony Reed. Directly across from us sat the absolute embodiment of unearned arrogance and toxic entitlement. Barbara wore a sharp new designer blazer she had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card specifically for this occasion. She sat completely upright in her expensive leather chair, her shoulders pulled back with a smug, victorious smile permanently painted on her face. Christopher and Megan sat closely behind her in the stiff observer chairs lining the back wall. They had eagerly attended the mandatory legal deposition for no other reason than to watch me bleed. They firmly and deeply believed they were about to witness the glorious moment I was finally exposed as a master manipulator and forced to surrender my entire life savings to them. Barbara's expensive litigation attorney was a large, imposing man who smelled heavily of cheap cologne and predatory confidence. He did not sit down. He leaned aggressively over the polished wooden table, invading my personal space, trying to establish complete physical dominance in the quiet room. He violently slammed the thin black binder I had willingly provided right onto the center of the table. The loud smack echoed sharply off the cold, paneled walls. He cleared his throat loudly and began his highly practiced theatrical performance for the captive audience. He dramatically opened the black binder and pointed a thick, accusatory finger at the corporate registration documents inside. He spoke with the incredibly aggressive, booming voice of a man who thought he had just caught a brilliant criminal completely red-handed. He loudly declared for the official legal record that his elite team of expensive forensic accountants had spent the last 3 weeks relentlessly analyzing the mysterious Delaware holding company. He proudly announced to the silent room that they had finally discovered the massive hidden financial asset I had so desperately and maliciously tried to conceal from my deeply devoted and suffering wife. He aggressively pulled out a certified stamped copy of a highly complex intellectual property patent. He slammed it down next to the binder. For 10 long years, while Barbara was sleeping peacefully in our large suburban house, completely oblivious to my heavy burdens, I had spent my quiet nights sitting entirely alone in my dark home office. I had meticulously coded and developed a highly advanced proprietary software algorithm. It was a brilliant piece of technical engineering designed specifically to automate deep forensic corporate auditing, capable of scanning millions of complex financial documents in mere seconds to detect microscopic anomalies and hidden fraud. The predatory lawyer proudly slapped his heavy hand against the patent document and loudly accused me of secretly licensing this revolutionary software to massive international accounting firms across the globe. He wildly and confidently claimed that the secretive Delaware holding company was quietly receiving massive hidden royalty checks every single fiscal quarter. He looked directly at Barbara, smiled a greedy, terrifying smile, and confidently stated on the legal record that my hidden software patent was easily worth over $5 million in liquid commercial capital. The very moment the words $5 million left the aggressive lawyer's mouth, the entire physical atmosphere in the small deposition room violently shifted. I watched carefully, my expression completely blank, as absolute, pure, unregulated greed completely consumed my entire family. Barbara actually gasped out loud, pressing her freshly manicured hand flat against her chest as her eyes widened with manic, intoxicating delight. She looked directly at me with a sickening expression of total, absolute vindication, firmly believing she had finally caught me in a massive, unforgivable lie. Christopher leaned so far forward in his stiff chair, he nearly fell out of it, practically salivating at the sound of the massive number. I could clearly see the desperate, frantic wheels turning rapidly in his head. Half of $5 million was more than enough to completely pay off his angry venture capital investors, save his failing fraudulent technology startup, and keep him entirely out of a federal prison cell. Megan let out a short, high-pitched laugh of pure, overwhelming relief. She was already mentally spending her massive share of the incoming settlement on brand-new luxury vehicles and wildly expensive overseas vacations to immediately replace the ones she had just lost to the towing company. They all stared intensely at the heavy black binder sitting on the table as if it were a solid, glowing brick of pure gold. The predatory lawyer smiled arrogantly, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and formally demanded that the $5 million hidden asset be immediately liquidated by court order and split directly down the middle as a legally binding marital asset. He confidently leaned back in his heavy leather chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and waited eagerly for me to panic, break down, and confess to my financial crimes. I did not panic. I did not break a sweat. I did not say a single word in my own defense. I simply turned my head slowly and looked calmly at Anthony Reed. Anthony did not raise his voice or attempt to match the incredibly aggressive theatrical energy of the opposing legal counsel. He simply reached down, opened his own sleek leather briefcase, and carefully pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy notarized parchment paper. He slid the single document slowly and deliberately across the polished wooden table until it rested directly in front of Barbara's incredibly smug attorney. Anthony politely and coldly suggested that the opposing legal team should have spent significantly more time reading the actual operational charter of the Delaware Holding Company, instead of wildly and recklessly guessing at its financial contents to inflate their own billable hours. Anthony calmly and surgically explained the brutal, undeniable legal reality of my quiet late-night engineering work. I had never sold the proprietary software algorithm for liquid cash. I had never licensed the complex auditing program to massive corporate accounting firms for my own personal financial gain. Instead, the exact moment the software patent was officially approved by the federal government 5 years ago, I legally transferred complete and total ownership of the intellectual property directly into a highly restricted, irrevocable philanthropic trust. Anthony pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the complex legal signatures securely locking the document. He coldly explained to the entirely silent room that the philanthropic trust was strictly and legally designed to generate operational software exclusively for nonprofit organizations, allowing them to audit their own charitable funds completely free of charge. I was merely the legal administrative director of the trust, meaning I simply had the unpaid authority to decide which charities received the protective software. However, under incredibly strict federal tax laws governing irrevocable trusts, I was completely and permanently barred from ever withdrawing a single penny of personal income, salary, or financial compensation from the corporate entity. The brilliant patent generated absolutely zero liquid cash for me or my estate. It had zero commercial market value in a divorce proceeding because I did not legally own it anymore. It belonged entirely to the charity. It was completely and entirely untouchable by any family court judge, any greedy ex-wife, or any predatory lawyer in the entire country. The heavy, crushing silence that suddenly fell over the small, claustrophobic deposition room was absolutely suffocating. The arrogant, victorious smirk completely melted off the opposing lawyer's face as his eyes frantically scanned the ironclad philanthropic trust documents. The warm color violently drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking incredibly sick. He flipped the singles page over, desperately looking for a legal loophole that simply did not exist. In one single horrifying moment, the expensive predatory lawyer realized the absolute devastating magnitude of his catastrophic professional failure. He suddenly realized that he had just aggressively billed Barbara over $50,000 in non-refundable legal fees, utilized countless hours of expensive private investigators, and ruthlessly chased a philanthropic charity fund that legally possessed absolutely $0 in liquid capital. He had spent weeks violently tearing apart my entire life, promising my greedy family millions of dollars, only to discover a legal ghost. He slowly looked up from the paper and stared directly at Barbara, the horrifying realization washing over him that his client was completely bankrupt and he was never going to get paid for a single minute of his aggressive theatrical work. The absolute failure of the legal deposition acted as a devastating earthquake that completely shattered the fragile foundation of my family's unholy alliance. When the predatory litigation attorney realized he had spent weeks aggressively chasing a charitable ghost and would not be receiving a massive percentage of a non-existent $5 million settlement, he did not simply walk away quietly. He immediately sent a heavily itemized, severely aggressive legal invoice directly to the sprawling suburban house. He demanded exactly $50,000 in legal fees, private investigator costs, and administrative expenses to be paid in full within 48 hours. If the invoice was not immediately satisfied, he threatened to place a mechanic's lien on the very house that was already actively defaulting on a massive commercial balloon mortgage. The heavy walls were rapidly closing in on them, and the suffocating pressure instantly turned them into desperate, starving animals trapped inside a shrinking cage. The grand suburban home that had once been their symbol of immense stolen wealth quickly transformed into a toxic battleground of constant vicious screaming. The thick illusion of family loyalty completely evaporated the moment the money disappeared. Barbara viciously turned on her own children. She stood in the center of the lavish kitchen and aggressively blamed Christopher for her impending homelessness, loudly reminding him that it was his massive corporate failure 7 years ago that had originally forced me to leverage the property in the first place. She conveniently ignored the undeniable fact that she had personally and violently demanded sole ownership of that very debt during the divorce. Christopher, completely blinded by his own rising panic, aggressively screamed right back at her. He viciously attacked his sister Megan, blaming her severe credit card debt and her reckless spending habits for draining the small amount of liquid cash they might have used to temporarily stall the bank foreclosure. They spent their days tearing each other apart, desperately trying to assign blame for a catastrophic disaster they had all gleefully built together. In the middle of this absolute chaos, a much quieter but far more devastating fracture was rapidly forming. Natalie, my son's wife, had spent the last several weeks silently watching the entire situation unfold with growing horror. She had happily cheered at my retirement party, firmly believing she had married into a wealthy, powerful family. But the glittering illusion of her successful entrepreneurial husband was rapidly dissolving before her very eyes, revealing the terrified, fraudulent little boy hiding underneath. Her final breaking point did not come from a screaming match in the kitchen. It arrived quietly in the morning mail. Natalie was sorting through a stack of final notice utility bills when she noticed a thick envelope from a notoriously predatory high-interest payday loan company addressed directly to her. Deeply confused, she opened the letter and pulled out a highly aggressive collection notice. The document explicitly stated that she was personally delinquent on a massive short-term emergency loan boasting a staggering 45% interest rate. Her eyes scanned down to the bottom of the printed contract, and her blood ran completely cold. There, printed clearly on the heavy paper, was her own personal signature authorizing the disastrous loan. But she had absolutely never signed it. The sickening truth washed over her in a wave of pure nausea. Several days prior, when the predatory litigation attorney had demanded a massive upfront cash retainer to initiate the aggressive lawsuit against me, Christopher had completely panicked. Knowing his own credit was completely destroyed and his failing business accounts were frozen, he had quietly stolen his wife's personal identity. He had utilized her excellent credit score to secretly secure a highly toxic predatory loan to fund his mother's legal war against me, and he had deliberately and maliciously forged Natalie's signature on the legally binding digital documents. He had selfishly sacrificed his own wife's financial future to desperately maintain his arrogant facade. Natalie did not scream. The profound betrayal completely bypassed anger and settled directly into absolute cold clarity. She walked upstairs to the master bedroom and methodically pulled her expensive leather suitcases from the top shelf of the closet. She began packing her clothes, her expensive jewelry, and her personal documents with surgical precision. Christopher walked into the bedroom a few minutes later, heavily sweating and looking incredibly haggard from another screaming match with his mother. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the open suitcases on the bed. He immediately tried to deploy his usual charming manipulation, desperately asking her where she thought she was going. Natalie simply turned around and dropped the aggressive collection notice directly onto the bedroom floor at his feet. She did not yell or cry. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She coldly informed him that she was filing a police report for identity theft the very moment she stepped out of the house. She told him their marriage was completely over, and she was immediately contacting a divorce attorney to legally separate herself from his massive impending criminal charges. Christopher fell to his knees, desperately begging her to stay, wildly promising that the massive bank loan would come through, or that he would somehow find a magical investor to save them all. Natalie simply zipped up her luggage, walked straight past him without a single word, and walked out the front door forever. She called a private car service and completely abandoned him to his self-made ruin. Sitting completely alone on the floor of the empty master bedroom, staring at the space where his wife's luggage used to be, Christopher finally crossed the absolute point of no return. His entire carefully crafted world had completely disintegrated. His wife was gone and threatening him with felony identity theft charges. His aggressive investors were demanding a forensic audit of his failing company by the end of the week. The commercial bank was preparing to legally evict him and his mother in a matter of days. He was completely trapped in a corner with absolutely no legal escape routes remaining. Pure, unadulterated desperation completely hijacked his rational brain, pushing him to make the most catastrophic and fatal mistake of his entire life. He convinced himself that he only needed a temporary bridge loan, just enough liquid cash to silence his angry investors and temporarily stall the aggressive bank foreclosure. He knew his mother was entirely bankrupt and his sister was completely ruined. He had absolutely nobody left to steal from except the very man who had quietly supported him his entire life. He desperately pulled his sleek silver laptop from his briefcase and opened a new private web browser. He navigated directly to the online portal of a massive national credit institution known for rapidly approving high-limit, unsecured personal lines of credit. Christopher knew every single detail of my personal identity. He knew my exact date of birth, my complex social security number, my previous residential addresses, and my mother's maiden name. He had watched me fill out countless financial forms over the decades. His hands trembled violently over the keyboard as he systematically began typing my highly sensitive personal information into the digital loan application. He was attempting to illegally open a massive $250,000 line of credit entirely in my name, completely intending to wire the massive funds directly into his failing business accounts the moment the loan was approved. He firmly believed that since I was quietly living in a remote location, I would never notice the sudden credit inquiry until it was far too late. He held his breath, checked the forged digital signature box claiming to be Michael Gallagher, and aggressively clicked the final submission button. He sat back in his chair, heavily wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, completely expecting to see a bright green approval screen. He foolishly believed he was a brilliant survivor executing a masterstroke of digital deception. He completely failed to realize that he was attempting to commit major financial fraud against a retired senior corporate auditor. The very morning after the catastrophic retirement party, while my toxic family was busy celebrating their hollow victory with expensive champagne, I had made one very quiet and highly strategic phone call. I had contacted the 3 major national credit bureaus and legally enacted a maximum security federal fraud alert and a total security freeze on my personal social security number. I had specifically flagged my own identity with the highest possible threat level, explicitly mandating that absolutely no new credit accounts, loans, or financial instruments could be legally authorized under my name without a rigorous in-person physical verification process involving multiple forms of government identification and my direct verbal consent. The moment Christopher clicked that final submission button, the complex digital application did not simply get declined. It immediately triggered a massive silent alarm deep within the national banking security network. The credit institution's automated fraud detection algorithms instantly flagged the digital application as a highly severe critical security breach. The system recorded the exact internet protocol address of his silver laptop, triangulating the exact physical location of the attempted felony directly back to the sprawling suburban house. The bank did not send a rejection email. Instead, their automated security protocol immediately compiled a comprehensive digital dossier of the attempted wire fraud and automatically forwarded the entire heavily encrypted file directly to the federal authorities for immediate criminal investigation. Christopher stared blankly at the computer screen, watching a small red error message vaguely stating that the application required further manual review. He frustratedly slammed his laptop shut, completely unaware that his desperate criminal action had just sealed his absolute and final destruction. He thought he was cleverly buying himself a little more time. He had absolutely no idea that he had just personally handed the federal authorities the exact undeniable evidence they needed to finally put him in a prison cell. The automated security protocol of a major national credit institution does not operate on a casual timeline. When a massive digital wire fraud attempt is detected, especially one involving the stolen identity of a retired senior corporate auditor with a maximum security federal fraud alert, the response is swift and absolute. I did not need to be physically present at the grand suburban house to know exactly what was happening. 30 years in the financial sector had given me a very clear understanding of how federal authorities handle severe white-collar crime. They do not send a polite email asking for clarification. They do not call to schedule a convenient appointment. They arrive with overwhelming authority to immediately neutralize the threat and secure all digital evidence. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. The manicured lawns and quiet streets of my former wealthy neighborhood were completely still. The heavy silence was abruptly broken by the arrival of 3 unmarked dark sport utility vehicles pulling sharply into the wide concrete driveway of the house. Several armed federal agents and local police officers stepped out of the vehicles wearing heavy tactical vests over their standard uniforms. They did not gently ring the doorbell and wait patiently for someone to wake up. They pounded heavily on the thick oak front door with the full force of the law, their voices echoing loudly across the sleeping suburban street, aggressively demanding immediate entry. Inside the house, the atmosphere of arrogant entitlement was violently shattered. Christopher was sitting alone in the dark living room, completely exhausted and heavily stressed from days of vicious arguing with his mother and the sudden departure of his wife. He was staring blindly at his silver laptop, still desperately hoping for a miraculous loan approval email that would never arrive. When the heavy pounding started, he froze in absolute terror. He slowly stood up, his legs shaking uncontrollably, and walked toward the grand foyer. Before his hand even touched the brass handle, the door was forced open. The federal agents flooded into the opulent entryway. They did not treat Christopher like a brilliant young technology entrepreneur. They treated him exactly like the desperate criminal he had chosen to become. An officer immediately grabbed his arms forcefully, turned him around, and pushed him face first against the expensive designer wallpaper. The cold steel of heavy metal handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, with a sharp clicking sound that instantly erased every single delusion of grandeur he had ever possessed. An older lead investigator stood in the center of the living room and began reading the official federal charges in a loud, booming voice. He formally charged Christopher with multiple counts of severe felony wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the attempted illegal procurement of a massive commercial credit line. The agent explicitly stated that the digital footprint of the massive fraudulent loan application had been tracked directly to the specific internet router sitting on the living room shelf and directly to the silver laptop currently resting on the coffee table. Christopher began sobbing uncontrollably. The highly polished, arrogant facade he had maintained for his entire adult life completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, broken little boy. He desperately begged the federal agents to listen to him, wildly claiming that it was all just a simple misunderstanding and that he was just trying to secure a temporary bridge loan for his legitimate business. The officers completely ignored his pathetic excuses. Two agents walked past him and immediately seized his silver laptop, his personal cellular phone, and several external hard drives, carefully placing the critical digital evidence into sealed, transparent bags. The loud commotion finally woke Barbara from her upstairs master bedroom. She rushed down the grand hardwood staircase wearing a silk bathrobe, her hair completely disheveled. When she saw her precious golden boy pressed roughly against the wall in handcuffs, her maternal instincts completely bypassed any logical reasoning. She charged aggressively toward the federal agents, screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She wildly demanded that they immediately release her son, proudly declaring that they were a highly respectable and wealthy family who did not deserve to be treated like common street criminals. When the lead investigator calmly instructed her to step back and not interfere with an active federal arrest, Barbara completely lost her mind. She pointed a shaking finger at the officers and hysterically accused me of being the true mastermind behind the entire situation. She screamed that her ex-husband was an evil, vindictive corporate auditor who was maliciously framing her innocent son to avoid paying a massive divorce settlement. She wildly insisted that they needed to immediately drive to my peaceful beach condo and arrest me for hiding millions of dollars in illegal offshore accounts. The federal agents looked at her with a mixture of extreme boredom and professional pity. They deal with the frantic, entirely illogical excuses of criminals and their enablers every single day. The lead investigator calmly pulled out a small notepad and informed Barbara that the federal fraud alert had been personally verified by me over a recorded security line. He plainly stated that the digital application had absolutely utilized her son's precise physical location and his personal computer. He looked her directly in the eye and coldly suggested that she stop screaming wild conspiracy theories and immediately hire a very competent criminal defense attorney for her son. They aggressively marched Christopher out the front door, his head hung low in absolute shame, and pushed him into the back of a dark police vehicle. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet suburban street, completely destroying whatever tiny shred of social reputation my family had left in that wealthy neighborhood. The cars quickly drove away, leaving Barbara standing entirely alone in the grand doorway of a massive house she could no longer afford to keep. The brutal reality of the criminal justice system moves incredibly fast when dealing with severe financial felonies. Christopher was immediately transported to the county holding facility and booked on federal charges. A judge was quickly assigned to his case for an initial bail hearing later that afternoon. Because the specific criminal charges involved the attempted theft of $250,000 and severe identity fraud against a protected senior citizen, the presiding judge viewed Christopher as a massive flight risk. The judge ruthlessly set his cash bail at an incredibly high $50,000. It was a staggering amount of liquid money that had to be paid immediately to the court to secure his temporary release pending a full criminal trial. Barbara was completely trapped in a massive financial nightmare of her own creation. She sat alone in the cold, sterile waiting room of the county jail, frantically calling every single person she knew. She called her wealthy friends from the country club, begging for a temporary loan. But word of the massive police raid had already rapidly spread through the neighborhood, and nobody wanted to associate with a completely ruined family. She desperately tried to call her daughter Megan, but Megan's phone went straight to voicemail as she was currently drowning in her own severe credit card debts and her crumbling marriage. Barbara had absolutely no joint marital funds left to steal. The massive investment accounts were completely empty, drained entirely by her own greedy early withdrawals and the resulting massive tax penalties. She could not borrow a single penny against the suburban house because the commercial bank had completely frozen the property title. She was entirely out of options. Driven by pure blind desperation to save her son from sleeping in a cold concrete cell, Barbara was forced to make the ultimate financial sacrifice. Long before our divorce, she had maintained a small, highly secure private emergency fund entirely in her own name. It was a very modest personal retirement account that I had always encouraged her to keep for her own financial independence. It contained exactly $55,000, representing the absolute entirety of her personal life savings. She had fiercely protected this small account during the divorce, firmly believing it was her ultimate safety net. Sitting in the bleak county jail, she realized she had to completely destroy her only remaining safety net to fix Christopher's massive criminal mistake. She tearfully contacted her private banking representative and authorized the immediate total liquidation of her entire personal retirement account. She absorbed the massive early withdrawal penalties and the severe tax hits, watching the entire balance instantly evaporate just to secure a certified cashier's check for the county court. She proudly handed the money to the bail bondsman, believing she was being a heroic and devoted mother. She completely failed to realize that she had just willingly made herself entirely destitute. She had traded her absolute final dollar to temporarily free a son who was completely guaranteed to end up in federal prison anyway. She walked out of the county holding facility late that evening, holding her completely silent, deeply traumatized son by the arm. They were both physically exhausted, completely terrified, and entirely bankrupt. They had absolutely nothing left in the entire world except the illusion of the grand suburban house. They drove quietly back to the wealthy neighborhood in a cheap borrowed car. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Barbara slowly walked up the concrete driveway, leaning heavily against Christopher for physical support. She was desperately looking forward to simply locking the heavy front door, hiding from the world, and sleeping in her expensive, comfortable bed. But as they approached the grand entryway, they both stopped completely frozen in their tracks. Taped securely to the thick wood of the beautiful front door was a massive, bright yellow legal document. It was stamped with the official seal of the county sheriff's department. Barbara reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the heavy paper from the door. It was the absolute final consequence of her aggressive greed. Her 14-day grace period to satisfy the massive commercial balloon mortgage had completely expired. The bank had officially executed the legal foreclosure. The massive document clearly and coldly stated that the property was now entirely owned by the commercial banking institution. It mandated that all previous residents were legally required to vacate the premises entirely within 48 hours, or they would be forcibly removed by armed county sheriffs. They had absolutely no money, no legal options, and no more wealthy victims to exploit. The trap had finally and completely snapped shut. The 48-hour deadline established by the county court did not care about Barbara's physical exhaustion or her desperate rising panic. It arrived with the cold, mechanical precision of a ticking clock. The sun rose slowly over the wealthy suburban neighborhood, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the absolute ruin my family had brought entirely upon themselves. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy rumble of massive diesel engines echoed loudly down the quiet, manicured street. Two large commercial moving trucks slowly backed into the wide concrete driveway, completely blocking any possible exit. They were immediately followed by two white county sheriff vehicles. The flashing lights reflected brightly off the grand front windows of the house, signaling to the entire neighborhood that a forced legal eviction was actively underway. Inside the sprawling house, the atmosphere was pure, uncontrolled hysteria. Barbara had not slept for 2 entire days. She had frantically paced the hardwood floors, desperately trying to formulate a magical plan to save her stolen kingdom. Now, as the heavy footsteps of armed deputies marched up the front porch, she was frantically running from room to room, shoving expensive silver picture frames and designer shoes into random cardboard boxes. She still blindly believed she could somehow negotiate with the bank representatives. She firmly thought her tears and her status as an older woman would suddenly force the cold financial system to show her mercy and grant her an impossible extension. The heavy oak front door was unlocked and pushed open by a stern county sheriff. He was closely followed by a senior asset recovery agent employed directly by the commercial bank. The agent wore a cheap gray suit and carried a metal clipboard. He did not look at the grand vaulted ceilings or the expensive imported chandeliers with any sense of awe. He looked at the property exactly as I had always looked at it. He saw it simply as a massive ledger of toxic debt that needed to be immediately liquidated. He stepped into the grand foyer and loudly announced that the property was now under the total exclusive legal control of the financial institution. He ordered everyone to immediately drop whatever they were holding and step away from the bank's property. Before Barbara could launch into another screaming, hysterical tirade, the front door opened again. Megan stumbled into the foyer looking completely destroyed. Her expensive tailored clothes were deeply wrinkled and her face was streaked with ruined makeup. She had not come to help her mother pack boxes. She had come because she literally had nowhere else to go. Her perfectly constructed, luxurious life had completely disintegrated in the span of a few short days. Megan collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase and began sobbing uncontrollably. She revealed the final devastating consequence of her own reckless financial deceit. Early that morning, her husband Brian had officially served her with emergency divorce papers. Brian was a highly calculating salesman who understood exactly when to cut his massive losses. The moment he realized the sheer catastrophic scale of Megan's secret credit card debt and the absolute financial toxicity radiating from her entire family, he had ruthlessly severed the cord. He had hired a vicious attorney to legally isolate his own professional income from her hidden liabilities. He had formally petitioned the court to leave Megan entirely responsible for the massive debts she had secretly accrued behind his back. He had locked her out of their upscale townhouse, canceled her access to their joint checking accounts, and completely abandoned her to her fate. Megan was completely bankrupt, homeless, and entirely alone. Barbara stared at her weeping daughter, completely unable to offer a single word of comfort. She could not save Megan because she could not even save herself. The bank representative loudly cleared his throat, completely indifferent to their unfolding family tragedy. He looked directly at Barbara and coldly informed her that she had exactly 15 minutes to gather her essential personal clothing and exit the premises permanently. Barbara pointed a shaking finger at the custom Italian leather sofa and the expensive, heavy dining room table, violently demanding the right to take her expensive furniture. The bank agent calmly looked down at his clipboard and shook his head. He systematically explained that because the massive commercial balloon mortgage had heavily defaulted, the bank was legally seizing all high-value physical assets currently located inside the property to partially satisfy the massive outstanding debt. The vintage wine cellar, the imported furniture, and the expensive electronics no longer belonged to her. They were now the exclusive property of the bank to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Absolute panic finally set in. With the armed sheriffs standing firmly in the hallway watching their every move, Barbara and Megan were forced to accept their deeply humiliating reality. They did not have enough time to carefully pack their expensive designer wardrobes into neat leather suitcases. In a moment of supreme crushing indignity, the bank representatives handed them several large black plastic heavy-duty garbage bags. The two women who had spent years looking down their noses at working-class people who had mocked my boring career and loudly applauded my public humiliation were now frantically sprinting through the master bedroom, shoving their expensive silk dresses and tailored blouses into cheap plastic trash bags. Christopher walked slowly down the stairs, carrying a single small canvas duffel bag. He looked entirely hollowed out. The terrifying reality of his impending federal wire fraud trial and the massive $50,000 cash bail that had completely bankrupted his mother had completely broken his arrogant spirit. He did not look at the bank agents. He did not look at his weeping sister. He simply walked out the front door, carrying his small bag, and sat down heavily on the hard concrete curb by the street. The 15-minute deadline expired without an ounce of mercy. The county sheriffs stepped forward and physically guided Barbara and Megan out of the grand house. Barbara tried to dig her heels into the expensive carpet, desperately clinging to the absolute last illusion of her wealth. But the officers simply marched her forward without a single word of sympathy. They pushed her out the front door and onto the concrete porch. The bank agent stepped outside and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind them. A professional locksmith immediately stepped forward carrying a heavy metal industrial drill. Right there in front of their tearful eyes, the locksmith violently drilled out the expensive brass locks and quickly installed heavy industrial deadbolts. The loud grinding sound of the metal drill was the final undeniable declaration of their absolute ruin. The grand suburban house was officially and permanently sealed. Barbara, Megan, and Christopher stood together on the cold concrete curb at the end of the wide driveway. They were completely surrounded by several large black plastic garbage bags filled with wrinkled clothing. The crisp morning air bit sharply through their thin jackets. Up and down the manicured street, the wealthy neighbors they had spent years trying desperately to impress were currently standing on their front porches or peering through their expensive window blinds, silently watching the entire humiliating spectacle. The public execution of their social status was absolute and complete. They had absolutely no money in their frozen bank accounts. They had no luxury vehicles to drive away in. They had no wealthy friends willing to answer their desperate pleading phone calls. They had entirely destroyed every single bridge they had ever built through their own boundless entitlement. Standing there on the cold street, shivering in the morning wind, Barbara reached into her pocket and pulled out her cellular phone. Her mind was completely fractured by the immense crushing weight of her total failure. In her desperate, twisted reality, she still firmly believed that she was the tragic victim of a cruel and evil mastermind. She desperately needed to hear my voice. She wanted to call me so she could scream at me and curse my name loudly in the street. More than anything, she fully expected me to answer the phone and maliciously gloat over her total destruction. She wanted me to laugh cruelly at her pain so she could finally validate her deeply held belief that I was a monster. If I gloated, she could convince herself that her ruin was entirely my fault and not the direct inevitable consequence of her own profound greed. She found my contact name in her phone and pressed the green call button with a violently trembling thumb. She held the phone tightly to her ear, holding her breath and preparing to unleash a massive torrent of vicious, hateful words. The phone began to ring. It rang once. It rang twice. The sound echoed hollowly in her ear. She waited anxiously for the satisfying click of the line connecting. She waited to hear my voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. She waited for the dramatic confrontation she so desperately craved to give her a final sense of twisted purpose. But the line simply continued to ring. I was sitting comfortably on the quiet, sunlit terrace of my beachfront condo, enjoying a hot cup of premium dark roast coffee. I saw her name flash brightly across the digital screen of my phone. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive triumph. I felt absolutely nothing at all. I simply picked up my phone, pressed the red button to decline the call, and permanently blocked her number from my device. On the cold concrete curb, Barbara listened as the ringing abruptly stopped and transferred directly to an automated voicemail system. The sheer, absolute silence on the other end of the line was infinitely more devastating than any hateful words I could have possibly spoken. It was the ultimate terrifying realization that she was no longer a factor in my life. I was not actively plotting against her. I was not celebrating her downfall. I simply did not care that she existed anymore. She lowered the phone slowly from her ear, staring blankly at the black plastic garbage bags resting by her feet, entirely consumed by the crushing, permanent silence of her absolute ruin. 5 months had passed since the heavy steel locks were drilled into the front door of the suburban house. The passage of time is a fascinating concept. For those who live in constant debt and deception, time is a terrifying predator constantly hunting them down and demanding payment. But for a man who has finally balanced the ledgers of his own life, time becomes a gentle and quiet companion. I was sitting on the private terrace of a beautiful, modest beachfront condominium overlooking the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The morning air was warm and tasted faintly of sea salt. I held a ceramic mug of premium dark roast coffee, letting the gentle ocean breeze carry away the final lingering shadows of my previous existence. I had not purchased this peaceful sanctuary using my own legal name. My decades of experience in the highly complex world of corporate auditing had taught me the immense value of absolute privacy. I had utilized a separate, discrete, limited liability company managed by an independent third-party trustee to completely secure the coastal property. There were no public records connecting Michael Gallagher to this specific address. I had successfully vanished from their toxic radar, entirely free to finally enjoy the quiet retirement I had actually earned. I spent my mornings walking on the soft sand, my afternoons volunteering at a local community center, and my evenings reading heavy historical biographies while listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves. My heart rate was lower. My mind was incredibly sharp. The constant suffocating weight of my family's endless greed had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. The profound silence of the morning was softly broken by the electronic chiming of the security intercom mounted on the wall inside my kitchen. I took one final slow sip of my coffee, placed the ceramic mug gently onto the small glass patio table, and walked inside the condo. I pressed the flashing green button on the digital console. The voice of Marcus, the dedicated head of building security, echoed clearly through the small speaker. Marcus was a retired police officer who took his job incredibly seriously. He spoke with a deeply cautious and highly professional tone, politely apologizing for the unexpected interruption. He informed me that I had 3 uninvited guests currently standing in the lavish marble lobby of the building. Marcus hesitated for a brief moment before describing them. He stated that they were aggressively demanding to speak with me, but they did not look like the typical wealthy residents or affluent visitors who frequented the secure building. He described an older woman and 2 younger adults who appeared deeply agitated, incredibly exhausted, and physically unwell. They were refusing to leave the reception desk, and the older woman was quietly weeping. Marcus calmly asked if I wanted him to immediately escort them off the private property or contact the local authorities for trespassing. I did not need Marcus to read their names from a visitor log. I pressed a secondary button on the digital console, activating the live video feed from the primary lobby security camera. The high-definition color screen flickered to life, revealing the absolute devastating reality of their current existence. I stood silently in my pristine kitchen, staring at the digital monitor. The 3 people standing on the polished marble floor of the lobby were completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, entitled family that had proudly cheered at my retirement party 5 months ago. The heavy, brutal machinery of the real world had completely crushed their fabricated reality. Barbara was leaning heavily against the granite security desk. Her once perfectly styled hair was thin, graying, and completely unkempt. She wore a faded, oversized sweater that hung loosely over her frail frame, entirely devoid of the expensive designer labels she used to worship. The deep, dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent in cheap motels or temporary county shelters. She looked exactly like a woman who had gambled her absolute last dollar on a losing hand and had spent the last 5 months paying the terrifying price. Megan stood slightly behind her mother, nervously wrapping her arms tightly around her own waist. The confident, arrogant glow of the wealthy suburban housewife was entirely gone. She looked incredibly pale and dangerously thin. The bitter reality of her brutal divorce from Brian and the crushing, inescapable weight of her massive secret credit card debts had visibly aged her a decade. She kept nervously looking around the opulent lobby, clearly intimidated by the extreme wealth and security of the building, fully realizing that she was now entirely locked out of this world. But it was the physical appearance of my son Christopher that truly illustrated the absolute severity of their ruin. He stood rigidly by the glass entrance doors, staring blankly at the floor. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled charcoal suit he had worn on the morning of his arrest, but it now hung off his body like a cheap costume. He was wearing a heavy black electronic monitoring ankle bracelet strapped tightly above his worn-out leather shoe, indicating that he was currently out on a restrictive pretrial release awaiting his massive federal wire fraud sentencing. The terrifying weight of his impending federal prison sentence had completely broken his spirit. He looked like a hollow, empty shell of a human being, completely stripped of his arrogant delusions and forced to face the terrifying consequences of his own criminal actions. I stood there watching the silent video feed, analyzing their broken postures with the cold, calculated detachment of a senior auditor reviewing a completely bankrupt corporate ledger. Over the last 5 months, they had desperately tried to hunt me down. Anthony Reed had informed me that they had aggressively contacted my former employers, harassed my old colleagues, and even attempted to hire cheap private investigators with their last remaining pennies to locate my hidden assets. They had failed at every single turn because my financial defenses were absolutely impenetrable. Now, having completely exhausted every single desperate avenue, having faced the brutal reality of homelessness, bankruptcy, and the criminal justice system, they had finally managed to track down the legal ownership of the coastal property through some obscure public filing. They had spent their last ounce of energy traveling to my secure sanctuary, not to demand money, but to beg for mercy. I kept my finger pressed firmly on the intercom button. I had absolutely no legal or moral obligation to speak to them. I owed them nothing. I had silently paid their debts, absorbed their insults, and protected them from their own reckless stupidity for 3 entire decades. The moment they stood up and eagerly applauded my public execution, they had permanently severed the heavy chains of my paternal responsibility. I could easily instruct Marcus to forcefully throw them out into the street. I could have them legally arrested for trespassing and never have to look at their faces ever again. That would be the easiest and most logical decision. However, a senior auditor never leaves a massive ledger completely open. A final accounting must always be officially closed and permanently archived. They had traveled a very long way to desperately seek the financial savior they had previously discarded. They firmly believed that if they could just look me in the eye and cry enough tears, I would eventually weaken and open my wallet. They fundamentally misunderstood the core nature of the man they had betrayed. I did not want to leave them with even the slightest lingering glimmer of false hope. I wanted to look them directly in the eye and permanently extinguish the very last spark of their toxic entitlement. I leaned closely toward the kitchen microphone. My voice was perfectly steady, incredibly calm, and entirely devoid of any emotional warmth. I instructed Marcus, the security guard, to completely bypass the standard visitor protocols. I told him not to issue them temporary guest passes or offer them a seat in the waiting area. I told him to simply unlock the secure elevator and send all 3 of them directly up to the penthouse floor. Marcus sounded slightly surprised, but he immediately confirmed my strict instructions. I released the intercom button and watched the high-definition security screen as Marcus firmly directed my broken family toward the heavy glass elevator doors. I watched Barbara desperately try to smooth out her faded sweater while Megan wiped away a fresh stream of terrified tears. They slowly stepped into the steel elevator cabin, entirely unaware that they were not riding up toward a warm, emotional rescue. They were riding directly up toward their final, devastating judgment. I turned away from the digital monitor and walked slowly back out onto the beautiful sunlit terrace. I did not rush to clean the pristine apartment or prepare to play the role of a welcoming host. I simply stood by the glass railing, looking out at the endless blue horizon of the ocean, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves. I took a deep breath of the clean, salty air, centering my mind and preparing for the absolute final phase of my long, silent adjustment. I heard the soft mechanical chime of the private elevator arriving at my floor. I heard the heavy steel doors slide smoothly open in the private hallway. The final confrontation had officially arrived, and I was completely ready to balance the books once and for all. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open directly into the main foyer of my penthouse. My family stepped out tentatively, their worn leather shoes shuffling awkwardly against the pristine white marble floor. Their eyes immediately darted around the spacious open-concept living room, taking in the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the ocean. The minimalist, expensive furniture, and the absolute immaculate cleanliness of my new life. They looked exactly like shipwrecked castaways, washing up on the pristine shores of an exclusive luxury resort. They brought the harsh, sour smell of stale street sweat, cheap motel soap, and profound desperation directly into my quiet, sunlit sanctuary. I did not move toward them to offer a comforting embrace. I stood perfectly still by the large glass balcony door, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my tailored linen trousers. I did not offer them a comfortable place to sit. I did not offer them a simple glass of cold water. I simply looked at them and waited in absolute silence for their highly anticipated performance to begin. Barbara was the very first to break the heavy, suffocating silence. She took a hesitant step forward and immediately burst into a theatrical, sobbing display of tears. It was a highly practiced emotional manipulation tactic she had used successfully for decades to win every minor argument in our marriage. However, without her expensive salon makeup, her perfectly styled hair, and her designer clothes, the performance simply looked deeply pathetic and entirely hollow. She reached out with violently shaking hands and desperately pleaded with me to take them all back. She aggressively blamed the entire 5-month nightmare on her predatory litigation attorney. She wildly claimed that she had been completely confused, severely stressed, and deeply manipulated by his aggressive legal advice. She desperately spun a highly fictional narrative where she was nothing more than a naive, loving wife who had been tragically tricked by a broken legal system. She swore with tears streaming down her pale cheeks that if I just allowed her to move into the beachfront condo, she would dedicate the rest of her natural life to rebuilding our sacred marriage and taking care of me in my old age. She spoke rapidly, her voice cracking, acting as if the catastrophic and highly public retirement party had just been a minor marital misunderstanding that could be easily erased with a simple, tearful apology. Christopher impatiently pushed his weeping mother aside completely, ignoring her emotional breakdown. He could not afford to wait for her to finish her pathetic performance because his timeline was strictly dictated by the aggressive federal court system. He looked at me with wild, bloodshot, terrified eyes. The arrogant, slick technology entrepreneur I had known for years was completely dead and gone. He confessed in a trembling voice that his legal defense had completely collapsed that very morning. His overworked public defender had formally informed him that he was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary for aggravated wire fraud and identity theft. The presiding judge had offered him a highly conditional last-minute plea deal, but it required him to secure immediate verifiable corporate employment and begin paying massive financial restitution to his defrauded investors before the final sentencing hearing next week. He suddenly fell to his knees right there on my expensive hardwood floor, the sound of his bones hitting the wood echoing sharply in the quiet room. He begged me to hire him as a highly paid consultant for my new corporate entity. He pleaded with me to call my old executive contacts at the auditing firm and secure him a basic entry-level accounting position. He desperately played the emotional family card, loudly, reminding me that he was my only son, and firmly insisting that a good father could never truly abandon his own flesh and blood to rot in a dangerous concrete prison cell. Megan did not cry, and she certainly did not fall to her knees in humility. Her deeply ingrained lifelong entitlement simply would not allow her to display genuine remorse, even when she was entirely homeless and carrying her belongings in plastic bags. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and looked around the expansive, luxurious living room with a highly critical and calculating eye. She loudly complained about how cruelly and unfairly her husband Brian had treated her during their rapid divorce proceedings. She painted herself as a pure, tragic martyr, who had been unfairly abandoned and financially ruined by everyone she had ever trusted. She then looked directly down the wide hallway at the closed wooden doors and boldly demanded to move into my spare guest bedroom. She did not ask for my permission. She stated it as a basic, unalienable right of birth. She confidently declared that she desperately needed a quiet, stable, and luxurious place to live, while she slowly rebuilt her corporate marketing career and searched for a new, wealthy husband. She firmly believed that my peaceful beachfront sanctuary was nothing more than a convenient free hotel entirely obligated to cater to her specific immediate needs. I let them speak until they were completely out of breath. I stood there and allowed the heavy silence to slowly fill the large room once again. I wanted them to hear the pathetic, hollow echo of their own desperate voices bouncing off the high ceilings and the glass windows. They stood closely together in the center of the room, looking at me with wide, expectant eyes. They were waiting for the familiar, comforting moment where I would sigh heavily, rub my temples, pull out my checkbook, and instantly solve all of their massive self-inflicted problems. They were waiting for the weak, compliant, and terrified man they thought they had married and raised to simply surrender to their demands. I finally took my hands out of my pockets and took one single deliberate step forward. My voice was incredibly calm, completely flat, and entirely devoid of any parental sympathy or marital warmth. I operated exactly like a senior auditor closing a severely bankrupt account. I looked directly at Barbara first. I firmly reminded her that she was not confused or manipulated by any predatory lawyer on the afternoon of my retirement party. I clearly pointed out the undeniable timeline, noting that she had meticulously planned the brutal public humiliation weeks in advance of ever hiring that attorney. I recited her exact words back to her with absolute chilling precision. I reminded her that she had boldly and proudly announced to 50 of my professional colleagues that she was finally freeing herself from a dead-end marriage. I told her that she did not actually want a husband. She simply wanted an endless, automated bank account. The very moment she falsely believed she had secured the wealth through the aggressive court injunction, she had gleefully and mercilessly discarded me. I plainly stated that the transaction was complete, the ledger was closed, and I would never allow her toxic presence to infect my peaceful life ever again. I then turned my cold, analytical gaze toward my weeping son, still kneeling on the floor. I looked down at him and felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of necessary closure. I clearly reminded Christopher of the exact moment he stood in my old suburban home office and aggressively mocked my 30 years of grueling corporate labor. I recited his vicious, arrogant words back to him without missing a single syllable. I reminded him that he had looked me in the eye and called me a boring, terrified bean counter who had maliciously stifled the family's true potential. I calmly explained the brutal logic of his current situation. A terrified bean counter simply does not possess the institutional influence or the professional desire to secure corporate employment for a convicted federal felon. I firmly told him that I would absolutely never risk the pristine legal reputation of my new corporate entity to shield a man who had cowardly attempted to steal $250,000 using my stolen identity. I stated with absolute finality that his impending federal prison sentence was the exact structured environment he desperately needed to finally learn the true value of hard work and basic personal accountability. Finally, I looked directly at my daughter. Megan instinctively took a nervous step backward when she saw the absolute unyielding finality in my eyes. I reminded her of the sickening, crisp sound of her enthusiastic applause echoing loudly through the rented banquet hall, while her mother maliciously handed me divorce papers. I told her that she had happily cheered for my sudden departure from her life, and I was simply honoring her ultimate public wish by making that departure absolutely permanent. I clearly informed her that there was absolutely no guest bedroom available for her in my home. I explained that she was a 35-year-old adult who had entirely destroyed her own marriage through massive secret financial deceit, and she was now entirely responsible for finding her own shelter in the real world. I systematically dismantled every single pathetic excuse, every single fabricated lie, and every single desperate plea they presented. I utilized their own arrogant, hateful words from 5 months ago as the very weapons to permanently and cleanly sever our family ties. The absolute silence that followed my words was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a deep underwater trench where the immense crushing pressure simply extinguishes all remaining light. I had just taken their own arrogant, hateful words from the retirement party and utilized them as surgical instruments to completely dismantle their pathetic excuses. I watched the profound shock wash over their exhausted faces. For their entire lives, they had operated under the incredibly toxic assumption that I was an endless emotional and financial well. They firmly believed that no matter how violently they abused me, how deeply they betrayed me, or how loudly they cheered for my destruction, I would always eventually surrender. They were entirely incapable of comprehending the absolute finality of a closed ledger. Barbara simply refused to accept the terrifying reality standing directly in front of her. Her mind violently rejected the concept that she had permanently lost her absolute control over me. She stepped forward again, completely ignoring the devastating logic I had just presented. She dropped the theatrical tears and shifted her strategy toward desperate, frantic bargaining. She wildly promised that she would never ask for the beachfront condominium again. She begged for a small, temporary loan, simply asking for $10,000 to secure a modest apartment and buy a cheap used car. She desperately claimed that after 38 years of marriage, I owed her at least a basic survival fund. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, firmly expecting my heart to finally break at the pathetic sight of her begging on my expensive hardwood floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I turned away from her completely, ignoring her desperate bargaining, and walked slowly across the wide living room. I approached a sleek, minimalist console table resting quietly against the massive glass wall. I had carefully prepared for this exact inevitable moment several days in advance. I reached down and picked up 2 separate pieces of printed paper. I turned around and walked slowly back to the center of the room, where my shattered family stood, huddled together, like terrified strangers. I stopped directly in front of my son. Christopher was still kneeling on the floor, the heavy plastic of his federal ankle monitor pressing uncomfortably against his leg. He looked up at the folded piece of paper in my right hand with a desperate, starving hunger. He was practically vibrating with frantic anticipation, fully believing that I was finally handing him a certified cashier's check to silence his angry investors, or a signed corporate employment contract to satisfy his federal judge. He reached out with a violently trembling hand, and I placed the single sheet of paper directly into his palm. Christopher rapidly unfolded the paper, his eyes desperately scanning the black ink. I watched the tiny remaining spark of hope completely instantly vanish from his eyes, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. I had not given him a check. I had not given him a job. I calmly and coldly explained that I had personally researched and printed a comprehensive list of the most severely underfunded, violently overworked public defenders currently operating in the federal judicial district. I clearly told him that buying his way out of his catastrophic mistakes was a luxury he had permanently exhausted 7 years ago. I stated with absolute chilling finality that the massive, aggressive machinery of the federal judicial system did not care about his tailored suits, his arrogant startup pitches, or his wealthy suburban upbringing. I told him he was going to walk into that federal courtroom entirely alone, represented by an exhausted public servant who barely had 10 minutes to review his massive wire fraud case. I told him to accept his impending 5-year prison sentence with whatever tiny shred of remaining dignity he could possibly find. Christopher dropped the piece of paper onto the floor as if it had suddenly caught fire. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep silently, his shoulders violently shaking as the absolute inescapable reality of his federal prison sentence finally crushed him. I turned my cold, analytical gaze toward Barbara. She was staring at my empty right hand, slowly realizing that I was absolutely not reaching into my pocket for a heavy checkbook. I held out my left hand and offered her a single plain white business card. She snatched the small card from my fingers with aggressive, frantic speed, violently bringing it close to her face to read the plain black text. She firmly believed it was the contact information for my private wealth manager, or perhaps the address to a luxury extended stay hotel I had generously booked for her. She read the words printed on the card, and the remaining color completely drained from her deeply lined face. It was not the address to a luxury hotel or a private banking advisor. It was the physical address and the strict intake schedule for a highly overcrowded state-funded low-income women's shelter located in the absolute worst and most dangerous industrial district of the city. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and systematically explained the brutal mechanical reality of her brand new life. I told her that the state-funded shelter strictly closed its heavy metal doors at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. I clearly warned her that if she was not physically standing in the intake line by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she would be forced to sleep on the cold concrete sidewalk. I reminded her that she had proudly demanded her absolute freedom at my retirement party, and I was simply facilitating her total independence. I firmly stated that she was now entirely free to navigate the terrifying, brutal reality of extreme poverty without the suffocating burden of my financial protection. I told her that every single time she stood in line for a hot meal or slept on a thin plastic mattress, she should vividly remember the exact taste of the expensive vintage champagne she had so proudly opened to celebrate my destruction. Megan immediately stepped forward, her fists clenched tightly at her sides, furiously demanding her share of the consequences. Her deeply ingrained toxic entitlement absolutely refused to let her be ignored. She aggressively demanded to know what I was going to give her, perhaps desperately hoping for a small cash handout just to make her quietly go away. I looked at my daughter and I handed her absolutely nothing. I gave her completely empty air. I did not offer her a piece of paper, a business card, or a single dollar bill. I coldly explained that Christopher was receiving a public defender list because he was facing federal prison. Barbara was receiving a shelter address because she was entirely destitute. But Megan was receiving absolutely nothing because her ultimate and final punishment was my complete and total permanent absence. I clearly told her that she would spend the rest of her adult life aggressively drowning in her massive secret credit card debts, desperately trying to manipulate new victims to fund her luxury lifestyle, but she would never ever receive another dime of my hard-earned money. She was entirely, completely, and permanently cut off from my existence. Barbara suddenly dropped the small white business card. She lunged forward desperately, trying to grab my arms wildly, screaming that I could not possibly do this to them. She hysterically cried that I had to forgive them, begging for mercy and promising that they would change. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward, completely avoiding her grasping hands. I looked at all three of them standing in my pristine living room, and I delivered the absolute final judgment. I spoke with a voice as cold and hard as solid glacial ice. I told them that I absolutely refused to grant them entry into my sanctuary. I absolutely refused to give them a single penny of my wealth. And most importantly, I absolutely refused to offer them my forgiveness. I explained that forgiveness is a beautiful gift strictly reserved for people who experience genuine remorse, and they were only crying because they had finally been caught in their own massive, catastrophic trap. I turned my back on them, completely dismissing their existence, and walked directly toward the heavy steel doors of the private elevator. I firmly pressed the illuminated call button. The mechanical chime echoed loudly through the silent foyer, and the thick metal doors slid smoothly open, revealing the empty wooden cabin, waiting to carry them back down to their complete ruin. I turned around and pointed directly at the open elevator. I did not ask them to leave. I firmly and aggressively ordered them to get out of my home immediately. I clearly warned them that if they did not step into that elevator within the next 10 seconds, I would happily signal my security guard to physically drag them out of the building and have them formally arrested for criminal trespassing. They looked at me and they finally saw the absolute terrifying truth. The weak, compliant, generous man they had relentlessly abused and exploited for decades was completely gone. I was a towering, impenetrable wall of pure consequence. They had gambled their entire luxurious lives on their toxic arrogance, and they had lost absolutely everything. Christopher slowly stood up from the floor, entirely defeated. He picked up his canvas duffel bag and walked into the elevator without looking at me, his heavy ankle monitor dragging against the marble floor. Megan followed him immediately, her face completely pale, her eyes staring blankly ahead as the terrifying reality of her massive debts finally consumed her. Barbara was the very last to move. She slowly bent down, picked up the small white business card containing the shelter address, and clutched it tightly against her chest like a tragic lifeline. She looked at me one final time, desperately searching for a tiny flicker of hesitation or regret. She found absolutely nothing but cold, silent peace. She turned around and walked slowly into the elevator, joining her completely ruined children. I stood in the foyer and watched as the heavy steel doors slowly began to slide shut. I saw their terrified, exhausted faces slowly disappear behind the closing metal. The satisfying heavy click of the locking mechanism echoed through the quiet penthouse. They were gone. Their unearned greed had permanently severed their absolute only lifeline to survival. The massive heavy ledger of my past life was finally perfectly balanced and permanently closed. I was finally completely free. The heavy steel elevator doors closed, taking the last lingering remnants of my toxic past down to the ground floor and entirely out of my life. I stood alone in the grand marble foyer of my penthouse, but for the very first time in my entire adult existence, the silence did not feel heavy, suffocating, or isolating. It felt incredibly light and pure. It was the unburdened, peaceful silence of a man who had finally paid all his debts, severed his heavy chains, and permanently closed the final ledger. I walked back out onto the sunlit terrace, sat down in my comfortable chair, and finished my cup of coffee. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. Guilt is an emotion strictly reserved for those who have caused unwarranted harm. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the natural, crushing gravity of the real world to finally reach the people who had spent their entire lives trying to outrun it. My daily routine is no longer dictated by the frantic, endless demands of ungrateful children or the cruel complaints of a deeply bitter wife. Instead, I wake up early every morning with a completely renewed sense of genuine, authentic purpose. 3 days a week, I take a short, pleasant walk down the coastal road to the local community center. I do not spend my hard-earned retirement playing endless rounds of golf or sitting aimlessly in front of a television screen waiting for the days to pass. I sit at a modest folding table in a small, brightly lit room, utilizing my 30 years of highly specialized corporate auditing experience to actively protect those who cannot protect themselves. I volunteer my time at a free financial literacy clinic specifically designed to assist elderly citizens and vulnerable retirees. I spend my afternoons meticulously reviewing complex banking statements, identifying highly predatory lending contracts, and helping confused seniors navigate the terrifying maze of modern digital finance. I use the exact same analytical skills I once utilized to protect massive international corporations, but now I use them to save a widow from losing her small pension or to protect a retired factory worker from ruthless telephone scams. Watching the intense, profound relief wash over their faces when I successfully untangle their financial nightmares brings me a level of genuine joy that my own family never once provided. I finally realized that my decades of rigorous, boring corporate labor were never the actual problem. The problem was simply the ungrateful people I had foolishly chosen to work for. Later that evening, the sun began to slowly dip below the ocean horizon, casting a brilliant array of orange and purple light across the endless, dark water. My penthouse was not perfectly quiet tonight, but it was filled with the absolute right kind of noise. I was hosting a small, intimate dinner party on my private terrace. Anthony Reed, the brilliant wealth protection attorney who had helped me flawlessly execute my silent exit strategy, sat across from me holding a glass of excellent red wine. Beside him sat a few new, genuine friends I had recently met at the community center. They were honest, hard-working people who valued my quiet company, my conversation, and my character, rather than the available balance in my checking account. We ate a beautifully prepared meal, we laughed loudly at simple jokes, and we shared genuine, heartfelt stories of our lives. There were absolutely no hidden agendas. There were no manipulative tears, no aggressive demands for expensive luxury gifts, and no cruel insults disguised as family banter. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the toxic, humiliating retirement party that had initially sparked this entire journey. That night, standing in a rented banquet hall surrounded by the sickening applause for my public destruction, I had felt entirely invisible and entirely worthless. Tonight, sitting under the clear stars with people who truly respected me, I felt completely alive and entirely whole. When the dinner was finally over and my guests had safely returned to their respective homes, I stood alone by the glass railing of the balcony, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the dark ocean waves against the sandy shore. The cool night air brushed against my face as I deeply reflected on the massive sweeping changes of the last 5 months. I have learned a deeply profound and fundamental truth about human nature. We are constantly taught from a very young age that blood is the absolute strongest bond in the world, and that family must be protected and preserved at all costs, regardless of the severe personal damage we must endure. But I now know that is a dangerous, highly toxic lie. True loyalty is not an automatic birthright granted simply by shared genetics. It is a fragile bridge that must be constantly maintained through mutual respect, basic gratitude, and genuine care. Entitlement is a deadly, invisible poison that slowly rots the human soul, convincing greedy people that the endless sacrifices of others are simply their natural right. I spent 30 years silently absorbing their failures, paying their massive debts, and swallowing my own pride simply to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy, successful family. I foolishly believed that my endless sacrifice would eventually earn their love and respect. But endless sacrifice without firm boundaries only breeds endless contempt. It was not until I finally closed the vault, locked the doors, and completely removed my financial protection that the absolute terrifying truth of their true nature was fully revealed. I am Michael Gallagher. I am 66 years old, and I am finally living a life built on solid rock, not shifting sand. The silent adjustment is officially complete. The ledgers are perfectly balanced. The toxic debts have been permanently erased from my life, and my future belongs entirely to me. Did you find satisfaction in my story? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic people who simply refused to appreciate your endless sacrifices? Please let me know your thoughts and tell me what city you are watching from in the comments below. If you believe in the absolute power of setting firm boundaries and reclaiming your own life, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and personal triumph. Thank you so much for listening to my journey, and I will see you in the next story.